Story 1. The Silt of Memory. The traveler sat by the edge of the great river where the silt turned to gold under the dying sun of the Magadha plains. His mind was a labyrinth of echoing voices and the ghost of a touch that had vanished like the morning mist over the northern marshes. He watched the water swirl in endless cycles and felt the heavy weight of a grief that seemed to define his very existence. To him, the loss was a mountain that would never move, yet the silent figure of the enlightened one sitting beneath the nearby pipal tree suggested a different truth. The Buddha did not speak, but his presence was a mirror to the chaotic turbulence within the man. The mind seeks to freeze time and capture the essence of a beloved in a permanent amber of memory. But the reality of the universe is a constant dissolution of form. Every atom of the body that once held the beloved has migrated, and every thought that once perceived them has vanished into the void of the past. The suffering arises not from the loss itself, but from the refusal of the consciousness to acknowledge the fluidity of its own nature. The traveler looked at the ripples and tried to find the same wave he had seen moments before, but the river had already carried it toward the distant ocean. His internal landscape was cluttered with the debris of a broken promise, an architecture of sorrow built upon the illusion that anything in this sensory realm could remain static. He felt the heat of the earth beneath him, a warmth that had been there for 1,000 years and would remain long after his own breath had ceased. The mechanics of his mind were like a weaver trying to use broken threads to create a garment that would never fray. He realized that his heart was not actually broken, but rather it was expanding to accommodate a truth it had previously been too small to contain. The silence of the forest was not an absence of sound, but a presence of profound observation. He saw the way the shadows lengthened over the dusty road and understood that the light and the dark were not enemies, but participants in a singular movement. His attachment was a tether to a ghost, a mental construct that insisted on the reality of a person who was merely a collection of changing attributes. The Buddha remained still, an embodiment of the space between thoughts where no grief can reside. As the traveler breathed in the scent of damp earth and wood smoke, he noticed the subtle shift in his own chest, a loosening of the grip he held on his own narrative. He was no longer the man who had been left behind, but the awareness that witnessed the leaving. The river continued its journey, indifferent to the names humans gave to its various points of passage. In the depths of his awareness, the traveler began to see that the beloved was never a separate entity, but a reflection of his own capacity for light. To lose the reflection is not to lose the light itself. The mind began to settle like the sediment at the bottom of a calm lake. He observed the impulse to reach out into the darkness and recognized it as a habitual spasm of the ego. The vastness of the Indian night began to swallow the horizon, and with it, the sharp edges of his personal tragedy began to blur into the cosmic dance of appearance and disappearance. He was learning the art of letting the world be exactly as it is without the interference of his desires. The stillness of the enlightened one was a silent invitation to enter the kingdom of the present moment where no loss is possible because nothing is truly owned. He watched a single leaf fall from the pipal tree and land softly on the surface of the water. It did not struggle against the current. It did not mourn the branch it had left behind. It simply moved with the inevitable grace of the whole. The traveler closed his eyes, and for the first time in many months, he felt the cool air of the night enter his lungs without the restriction of a hidden sob. The journey was not about reaching a destination where the pain would end, but about becoming the vast space in which the pain was allowed to dissolve. He was a witness to the profound mechanics of the soul, a silent observer of the rise and fall of empires within his own breast. The river flowed on. The stars emerged. The heart stayed open. Story 2. The Architecture of Absence. In the shadow of the Vulture Peak, where the wind howled through ancient crevices and carried the scent of jasmine from the valleys below, a young seeker sat with a heart fractured by the departure of a companion. The world seemed to have lost its color, and the vibrant greens of the bamboo groves appeared as mere shades of gray in the twilight of his despair. He looked upon the Buddha, who was walking slowly through the clearing, and felt a surge of resentment for the stillness he witnessed. His mind was occupied by the periphery of his awareness, where the ghosts of shared smiles and whispered words resided like uninvited guests in a ruined temple. He did not yet understand that the heart is like a monastery built on shifting sands, and every pillar of attachment is destined to crumble under the weight of time. The enlightened one moved with a grace that suggested he was part of the wind and the stones rather than a separate entity trapped in the prison of personal history. The seeker watched as a single drop of rain fell from a leaf and merged with the soil, and in that moment he felt the profound weight of his own resistance to the natural order of decay and renewal. His thoughts were like birds trapped in a cage of their own making, beating their wings against the bars of what used to be. He was obsessed with the symmetry of the past, trying to reconstruct a broken vessel using the shards of his own longing. The Buddha stopped and looked toward the horizon, where the mountains met the sky in a seamless union of earth and air. There was no effort in his gaze, no grasping for a specific outcome or a return to a previous state of being. The seeker realized that his grief was a form of mental architecture, a complex structure he had built to protect himself from the vast emptiness of the universe. He was mourning the loss of the walls he had built around his soul, mistaken for the soul itself. The movement of his mind was a series of frantic reaches into a void that could never be filled by another person. He saw the way the light played upon the bark of the ancient trees and noticed that the tree did not ask for the sun to stay when the night approached. The forest lived in a state of perpetual surrender, a constant giving away of its leaves and its blossoms to the hungry earth. The seeker began to investigate the texture of his own sadness and found that it was not a solid object, but a shifting cloud of sensations and memories. It had no core and no permanent residence. It was a guest that had stayed too long because he had provided it with a comfortable room in his consciousness. The silent lesson of the mountain was that the peak is only visible because of the valleys that surround it. Joy and sorrow were the two slopes of the same mountain of experience. He felt a subtle shift in his breathing as the tension in his shoulders began to dissipate like smoke in a gentle breeze. He was learning to observe the mechanics of his own craving without being consumed by them. The presence of the Buddha was a reminder that there is a place within the human spirit that remains untouched by the storms of the heart. This place is not a destination, but a way of seeing. It is the ability to witness the birth and death of every moment with an equal measure of compassion and detachment. The seeker looked at his hands and saw the lines and the skin that were also in a state of slow transformation. He was not the same person who had entered the forest that morning, and he would not be the same person when the moon reached its zenith. The illusion of a permanent self was the source of all his tribulations. By letting go of the need to be someone who was loved by a specific person, he was becoming the love that sustains the entire world. The silence between the trees became a symphony of subtle movements, and the darkness was no longer a threat but a soft blanket of rest. He stood up and began to walk in the same direction as the Buddha, not because he wanted to follow him, but because he had finally joined the flow of the universe. The path was long and the stones were sharp, but his step was lighter than it had been in years. He was no longer carrying the heavy burden of a yesterday that could never be reclaimed. He was simply a traveler in the vast expanse of the now. The stars above the Vulture Peak shone with a cold and ancient light. indifferent to the small dramas of the human heart, yet illuminating the path for those who are brave enough to walk through the ruins of their own expectations. He was home. Story 3. The Mirror of the Sal Forest. The traveler found himself standing by a stagnant pond in the deep shade of the Sal Forest, where the air was heavy with the scent of decomposing leaves and the promise of a coming storm. His chest felt like a hollowed-out vessel where the wine of his youth had turned to vinegar, and the memory of a face he once adored acted as a shard of glass cutting into the very fabric of his being. He looked into the dark water and saw not his own reflection, but the distorted image of everything he had lost and everything he believed he could never regain. Nearby, under the canopy of an ancient tree, the Buddha sat in a state of absolute stillness, as if he were the axis upon which the entire forest revolved. The traveler wondered how a man could remain so unperturbed while the world was so clearly a place of jagged edges and sudden departures. He observed the way the water in the pond did not try to hold on to the image of the clouds that passed over it, nor did it mourn the disappearance of the dragonflies that skated across its surface. The mind, he realized, is essentially a mirror that has forgotten its own nature and has instead become convinced that it is the images it reflects. His suffering was the result of a cognitive error where the consciousness had identified with a temporary arrangement of conditions and now felt a sense of annihilation because those conditions had shifted. The grief was a ghost limb still twitching with the phantom sensation of a touch that no longer existed in the physical realm. He watched a small frog leap into the water, and the resulting ripples spread outward until they reached the muddy banks and disappeared into the silence. The pond did not retain the ripple. It did not harbor a grudge against the frog for disturbing its peace. It simply returned to its original state of transparency. The traveler began to contemplate the substance of his own identity and found it to be as elusive as the mist clinging to the mountainside. He had spent years building a fortress of expectations around a person who was herself a river of changing thoughts and cellular decays. To love is to witness the flow of another, and to let go is to acknowledge that the flow has moved beyond the field of one's immediate perception. The Buddha's presence was a silent discourse on the emptiness of all phenomena. This emptiness was not a void of nothingness, but a field of infinite potentiality where things arise and pass without ever leaving a permanent mark on the underlying reality. The man felt the pressure in his heart begin to soften as he understood that he was not losing a part of himself, but rather he was being invited to release a burden he was never meant to carry alone. The mechanics of his mind began to slow down, and the frantic internal dialogue about what could have been or what should have been was replaced by the simple observation of what is. The damp earth under his feet was cool, and the distant thunder was a reminder of the vast elemental forces that dwarf the petty concerns of the ego. He saw that his broken heart was merely a doorway that had been forced open by the violence of change, allowing a larger truth to enter. The shadows of the Sal forest grew long, and the first drops of rain began to fall, creating a symphony of soft impacts on the surface of the pond. Each drop was a discrete event, yet they all contributed to the single reality of the rain. He breathed in the ozone and the wet dust and felt a strange sense of liberation in the realization that he was as transient as the storm. The enlightened one remained unmoved, but in that immobility there was a profound movement of compassion that seemed to envelop the entire grove. The traveler did not need to speak or to be spoken to because the silence had already answered the questions he had been too afraid to ask. He was the water, and he was the reflection, and he was the space in which both existed. The heavy knot in his stomach, which had been his constant companion for 7 months, began to unravel, and he felt the energy of his grief being recycled back into the earth. He was no longer a victim of time, but a participant in its unfolding. The path back to the village was still long, and the night would be dark, but he walked with the quiet confidence of one who has seen through the illusion of the solid self. The forest whispered its secrets to the wind, and the traveler listened with a heart that was no longer broken, but whole in its brokenness. Story 4. The Weaver of Shravasti. The potter's wheel spun in a rhythmic hum near the gates of the Jetavana monastery, where the dust of the road settled on the petals of the blue lotus flowers. A woman who had once been a queen but was now a wanderer in the landscape of her own sorrow sat in the dirt and watched the clay take shape under the craftsman's hands. Her mind was a tapestry of golden halls and the warmth of a hand that had been cold for 3 winters. She lived in the echoes of a palace that had been razed by time and the cruelty of shifting alliances. To her, the present was an ash heap and the future was a terrifying void where no familiar faces would ever appear. She looked toward the Buddha who was walking near the edge of the woods, and his orange robe seemed to capture the very essence of the setting sun. There was a quality of lightness in his step that she found incomprehensible, for how could anyone move so freely in a world where everything beautiful was eventually taken away? The potter added water to the spinning clay, and the form shifted from a tall vase to a wide bowl with a single touch. The woman realized that her own life was like that clay, but she had been trying to keep it in the shape of a vase long after the potter's hand had moved on. Her suffering was the friction between the spinning wheel of the universe and her own desperate attempt to stay the same. The mind constructs a sense of continuity by weaving together disparate moments into a single narrative of a life, but this narrative is an artifice that ignores the gaps between the threads. She was obsessed with the story of her loss, but she had forgotten that she was the one telling the story. The Buddha did not stop to lecture her, yet his very existence was a demonstration of the end of all narratives. He was the space between the notes of a song and the silence that remains after the music has faded into the night air. The woman felt the vibration of the earth as a caravan of merchants passed by on their way to the distant city of Shravasti. Their laughter and the jingle of their bells seemed to mock her internal desolation until she noticed that they too were merely passing through the frame of her perception. The internal landscape of her grief was a series of mental images that she mistook for reality. She was like a person trying to catch the wind in a net of silk. The mechanics of her perception were geared toward the preservation of a self that was already gone. She saw the way the potter did not mourn the loss of the vase when it collapsed into a heap of wet earth, but simply began again with a new vision. The clay was indifferent to its form. It was the potter's attachment to the form that created the potential for disappointment. She began to see that the man she had loved was also a form of clay, and the love she felt was the water that made the shaping possible. The love remained even if the form had returned to the earth. This realization felt like a cool breeze on a fevered brow. She observed the way her thoughts tried to pull her back into the burning palace of her memory, and for the first time, she simply watched them without following them through the gates. She was learning the discipline of the witness. The Buddha turned his head, and his eyes seemed to contain the vastness of the cosmos, yet they were also as clear as a mountain stream. In that brief glance, she felt the dissolution of her history. She was no longer a queen, and she was no longer a widow. She was simply a point of awareness, witnessing the spinning wheel of the world. The sun dipped below the horizon, and the shadows merged into a single velvet darkness that smelled of wood smoke and dried grass. The potter stopped his wheel, and the silence that followed was not empty, but full of the presence of the night. She felt the weight of her grief lift, not because she had forgotten the past, but because she had stopped trying to carry it into a future that did not exist. The architecture of her sorrow was being dismantled brick by the simple power of being present. She stood up, and the dust fell from her robes like the remnants of an old skin. The road ahead was uncertain, and she had nothing left of her former glory, but she felt a profound sense of wealth in the realization that the universe was her true home. The Buddha continued his walk toward the monastery, and she followed the sound of his footsteps on the dry ground. She was a part of the movement of the stars and the turning of the earth. She was the clay and the wheel and the hand that shapes them both. Story 5. The Ghats of the Eternal Flow. The elderly merchant stood upon the ancient stone steps of the Ghats in Varanasi, where the river Ganges flowed like a vast silver vein through the scorched body of the earth. His mind was a heavy anchor dropped into the depths of a dark and turbulent sea, where the memory of a lifelong companion resided as a phantom light in the crushing pressure of his loneliness. He watched the smoke from the funeral pyres rise in slow and deliberate spirals toward the amethyst sky, and felt a profound weight in his chest, as if the very air he breathed had been transformed into a solid mass of grief. Nearby, sitting upon a weather-worn platform of basalt, the Buddha remained in a state of absolute stillness, as if he were the silent axis upon which the entire frantic movement of the city revolved. The merchant observed the way the orange flames consumed the sandalwood logs and the physical remains of those who had once walked the dusty streets, and he felt a surge of bitterness toward the indifference of the universe. To him, his loss was a singular tragedy that demanded the world should cease its motion. Yet the river continued its journey, and the birds continued their flight, and the Buddha continued his meditation without the slightest deviation. The internal landscape of the man was a complex labyrinth of mental images, where the voice and the touch of the beloved were replayed in an endless loop of sensory craving. He was trapped in a cognitive architecture of his own making, where the past was more real than the stone beneath his feet. The mechanics of his mind were laboring under the illusion of a permanent, separate entity that had been stolen from him by the hand of death. He did not yet perceive that the person he mourned was not a solid object, but a shifting confluence of thoughts and feelings and biological processes that had been in a state of flux since the moment of birth. The Buddha's presence acted as a silent mirror to this internal chaos, showing him the nature of interdependence that governs all life. Every breath the merchant took was borrowed from the air, and every drop of blood in his veins was a gift from the water and the earth, and every thought in his mind was a reaction to 1,000 external causes. The beloved was not a separate shore, but a wave in the same ocean that he himself inhabited. As he watched the river, he began to see that the water at his feet was not the same water that had been there a moment ago, and yet the river remained. His suffering was the result of a mind that tried to freeze the wave while ignoring the ocean. He began to analyze the texture of his sorrow and found that it was composed of 1,000 small resistances to the truth of change. The heat of the evening sun was fading, and the first stars began to emerge in the darkening canopy above the river. He felt a subtle shift in his awareness as the rigid boundaries of his personal identity began to soften like clay in the rain. He was not merely a man who had lost a wife, but a part of a cosmic process that was constantly giving birth and constantly dying. The realization was not a comfort in the traditional sense, but a profound expansion of his soul. He looked at the Buddha and saw that the enlightened one did not possess a secret shield against pain, but rather he had become the very space in which pain and joy are allowed to arise and vanish without leaving a scar. The merchant closed his eyes and listened to the rhythmic lap of the water against the stones, and for the first time in many years, he felt the silence of the river inside his own heart. The architecture of his grief began to crumble, and what was left was a vast and open field of awareness. He understood that to love truly is to accept the eventual departure of the beloved, and to be the river is to accept the movement toward the sea. The smoke from the pyres had vanished into the night, and the air was now filled with the scent of night-blooming jasmine. He took a deep breath and felt the interdependence of his own life with the stars and the water and the silent figure of the Buddha. He was no longer a broken man, but a witness to the eternal flow of existence. Story Story 6. The Echo in the Stone. High in the rugged passes of the Vindhya Mountains, where the wind carves ancient stories into the face of the red granite, a woman sat in the entrance of a small cave. Her heart was a shattered relic of a promise that had been broken by the winds of change and the inevitable decay of human intention. She had been a dancer in a distant court where the floors were made of polished marble and the air was thick with the scent of musk and rosewater, but she was now a wanderer in a landscape of solitude. The man she had loved had vanished into the service of a king, and the letters that once came by messenger had long since ceased to arrive. She looked upon the Buddha, who was standing by a thin waterfall that cascaded down the rock face, and his eyes were like the depths of a mountain lake that had never known the disturbance of a storm. Her mind was a frantic weaver trying to mend a garment that had already been reduced to dust by the passage of time. She was obsessed with the memory of her own beauty and the way it had been reflected in the eyes of her lover, but that reflection was now a ghost that haunted the halls of her consciousness. The movement of her mind was a series of painful contractions as she tried to grasp at a yesterday that had no physical reality. She saw the way the water hit the stones and broke into 1,000 tiny droplets, and she realized that each droplet was a moment of experience. Her suffering was the attempt to hold all the droplets together in a single static form. The Buddha moved with a grace that suggested he was part of the stone and the water rather than a separate self struggling against them. He did not offer words of consolation, but his very presence was an invitation to enter the state of equanimity that lies beyond the dualities of gain and loss. She began to investigate the mechanics of her own attachment and found that it was not the man she missed, but the feeling of being seen and valued. Her heart was not broken by another, but by her own insistence that her worth was dependent on the gaze of a specific person. The mountain did not ask for the admiration of the clouds, and the waterfall did not seek the approval of the forest. They simply were exactly what they were in each passing second. She felt the cool mist of the waterfall on her skin and the rough texture of the granite beneath her palms, and she began to anchor her awareness in the immediate sensory reality of the present. The internal dialogue about her lost love began to lose its power as she realized it was merely a collection of habitual thought patterns with no inherent substance. The Buddha turned to look at the setting sun, and the light illuminated the deep lines of wisdom on his face. He was a man who had seen the rise and fall of kingdoms and the birth and death of stars, and he remained in a state of perfect balance. The woman felt a surge of clarity as she understood that her heart was not a fragile vessel that could be broken, but a vast space that could contain everything. The pain was a guest in that space, but it was not the owner of the house. She began to cultivate a sense of equanimity by observing the rise of each memory and the fall of each regret with the same detached compassion that one might use to watch the movement of clouds. The mountain pass grew dark, and the sound of the wind became a low and steady hum that seemed to resonate within her very bones. She was no longer a dancer mourning her lost stage, but a conscious part of the living mountain. The promise that had been broken was a small thing compared to the eternal promise of the universe to always be in motion. She stood up, and her movements were slow and deliberate, as if she were learning to walk for the first time without the crutches of her history. The path down the mountain was steep and dangerous, but she felt a profound sense of safety in her own awareness. The Buddha had already disappeared into the shadows of the lower forest, but his lesson was written in the very air she breathed. She was the stone, and she was the echo, and she was the silence that followed. The broken heart had finally opened to the world.